Hello and welcome to another GeoControl tutorial, and in this one I am going to show you how to create easy landscapes for your video game. And GeoControl is a really nice program to do that in, and a lot of people have already put videos on YouTube regarding this, but I thought I would throw my 2 cents in there and show you easy ways of creating a landscape that will give you great results. And if you're a follower of my channel, then you'll understand that this will probably be beneficial to you because all of you guys say so anyways, so I'll just take your word for it. So, you open up GeoControl and we just get the default scene here, which is just randomly generated, and we don't want that. And you can watch the other 2 tutorials that I made to learn how to use the basic functions of GeoControl. So I'm just going to kind of speed my way through this and slightly go over different settings and features, but not go into great detail about them, but I will show you what I will start with. I'm going to keep the seed because I don't want the fractal noise to be generated differently every time I hit generate, so I'm just going to keep seed. And then depending on the kind of game you want to make, this is very important, your width and your height of your landscape. You don't want something to be very wide or very tall if you're making something small, but if you're making like an open world game, then this will matter most. So if I were to make an open world game, I would say 150 kilometers. Now that might be a little large. I'm not entirely sure because I'm not a game developer, so can't really hate me for saying 150 kilometers, but I would say that gives you enough playing room to create large amounts of areas to explore in and whatnot. And then the height, I would say go a little bit higher than the default set, so maybe around 89, 12, 14, or just a little bit higher. You don't have to stick with the defaults, but you're going to want to go a little higher anyways, because certain formations require more height. So let's get going. So this is what I'm going to keep: 150 kilometers and 8914, and everything right here is just keep it as it is. And then let's go to ISO lines, and we want to start on a new layer. And we want to work in real world layers. So you walk on the ground, you want to make a ground layer. So we're going to rename this one to ground. And hit OK. And then grab the pen tool here, which will let you draw your ISO lines. And we're going to take all of this away, and I'm going to drop this down to the strength maybe 200. And then I'm just going to draw random swirls here and there like this, and no rhyme or reason to it whatsoever. It just fills up a good amount of area. Generate. And what that'll do is it'll give us a lot of different elevation points. So we have right here, we can kind of see how it goes from a flat area up to maybe more hill area, then it's flat again down to more hills. So that gives us enough variation. Now take into account, which I didn't do, this doesn't matter because we don't have it selected, but just look at your first elevation bar. This is in meters, so it'll range from 0 all the way to the highest altitude point that you had set in the general tab. So you have to make sure that what would be a real world value where you're located or for your game or whatever that would give you some landscape features. This might actually be better than what I had before, but it's so minuscule it doesn't even matter. We're already getting really good variations here. So just play with the altitude. You might have to clear the layer like this, and then hit generate, and that'll clear the layer. And then you might have to redraw your ISO lines again. And you just randomly scribble it out, and there we go. We have more general variation in the landscape and whatnot. And there is a specific and scientific way of using ISO lines, or ISO lines, but the way I work with them is I just picture it as a landscape that I'm creating, and other ISO lines affect other ISO lines on the same layer, so you have to be very careful on that too. Next, I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to rename this one to maybe small hills, and hit OK. I'm going to raise the altitude a little bit more, and I'm going to take all this away except for this layer, this level. I'm going to take that down to 400. I'm going to take this down to maybe 100. Well, not that. I'm going to actually bring this down more, and I'm going to kind of invert it. So like that. There we go. And then I'm going to draw some more random shapes. I'm just going to kind of follow the different formations here and draw behind the formations, not in front, or else you'll affect those formations. Create, and there we go. Now we have more hills. And it looks kind of flat right here, but believe me, there are different variations in altitude. So we have it going like a good gradient from lowest elevation to higher elevation. And we don't want too many of these flat, low levels. In my experience, if you just take your ISO lines and you just kind of draw in there a little bit and then generate it, then fill those out, it'll look much better. Alright, let's add another one, and we're going to call these large hills. And we're going to raise the elevation again. And I'm going to take this almost, or I'm going to take that completely down. This one almost down. I'm going to raise this a little bit, raise that a little bit, raise that, and take that one away. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw just a nice random behind the variations, of course. Just randomly point out little large hills, little large. Like that. And what that'll do is it'll give us higher elevations again. And now, of course, this isn't real world values because this is more like a mountain, because even the tallest mountain peak I have in my area is about 3,000 meters. So these are going to be really tall, granted, but it'll work out in the end, believe me. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add another layer, and I'm going to rename this to mountains. And I'm going to hit OK, and from here I'm going to disable these two first levels. I'm going to raise this up to be like this, and mountains, I like to have the higher levels activated, and then I'm going to make sure I have that selected, and I'm going to just draw out like this in areas, and I'm going to put little arms coming off of them. Like that, just randomly. I don't have any desire to make something specific right now. If I did, I would be a little bit more specific, but I don't. So I'm just going to draw them coming off of these taller hills. Like that. Just generate that. And that gives a little bit more formation to our area. And let's go ahead and add another one. This is exactly what I wanted, actually. It looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and add another one. I just randomly did that, but it looked alright, so that looked good. I'm going to call this tall mountains, or you know what, let's just call these large mountains. Hit OK. And I'm going to disable these first two layers. I'm going to raise this up to be a little bit more strong, like that. And I'm going to add, and you kind of see how these layers work. Ground is just basic, adding more variation to it as I go along. You can kind of see. So keep in mind those values. And I'm going to enable height too, and I'm going to raise the altitude of these, not all the way to the top, but kind of high up there. And I'm going to make them so there's enough variation between the altitudes. And I'm going to just add them going out like this. Take into consideration the higher point will start where you first click, and then it will degrade down to the lowest altitude, as you can see here, and you can see the color changes. So make your changes exactly perfect, or else it's going to look weird. You want your peaks to be all in the same area. You don't want them to be scattered around differently. So just remember that. You can add even these little branches coming off like that. And we'll just continue going about our business. It's a little bit of a boring process after a while, but believe me, in the end, you're going to love being able to just do this rather than sculpt out your entire terrain. Trust me. You guys out there that already make landscapes, you already know. So, and we'll see what that looks like. Alright, we have these higher altitudes. I don't like this higher level right there, so I'm going to disable that and generate it, because it's making a little too harsh of a line. And it kind of disappeared a little bit, but that looks fine. Now I'm going to add one more, and I'm going to rename this to Tall Peaks. And this time I'm going to go almost all the way to the top. Not quite there, but almost. I'm going to enable the second height still. I'm going to raise that up. And I'm just going to go from here, and I'm just going to add little peaks to these. And you don't have to have them all in V shapes. They could just be little lines like that, or even little dots like that. And you want to change these values to almost what you had right here. So this one there, this one there, there, disable that, generate. 3D, and you can kind of see where those peaks came in. Looks good. That'll give you some variation in your landscape, so not everything's all the same level. And other than that, that's pretty much all we have to do. We have some plain, flat areas, and we have some hills and some midlands, and we have mountains, and then even tall mountain peaks. So that looks good. I'm going to add one more right here, actually, like that, and generate, because I didn't like the way that looked. Now we have two peaks there instead of one. So it looks good. All right, next, you want to go to Selector, and in here I'm going to rename this selection tool, and I just barely made a tutorial on this not too long ago, so if you want to learn how to use the selection tool in depth, please go ahead and watch that. And I'm going to go ahead and name this Ground Selection. And if you remember, we had the minimum height of the ground about right there. So we want the min to be, or the max was about right there, but we want the minimum to be 0, and we want the max to be about that area. And I'm going to turn fuzzy up on the max, because it doesn't matter on the minimum because it's set to 0 already, so you can't feather down anymore. So we're just going to feather up in altitude. I'm going to change that to add, and let's create that and see what we get. We need a little bit more, so let's go ahead and raise that. Okay, that looks good. So that's a little bit better. Let's go and make sure you click on Create again. You don't have to do it so many times, but I just make sure I do it, because then when you go to Filter, and then you add your, your general forming filters or your shape filters and whatnot, you make sure you have the selection made. I'm going to go to Canyons, and I'm going to go to Settings and change my selection to Ground Selection. I'm going to go to the presets, because I'm not going to go into too much detail on this right now. So I'm going to change that to that, and let's go ahead and generate. Well, that looks good. That gives us some peaks and some terracing. So I'm going to keep that, and I think that ought to do it for our ground level. Let's go back to Selector. Let's add another one, and let's call this one Higher Hills, because this is going to affect all the hills from the ground up to where the mountain peaks start. So we want to enable this, and we don't want minimum of 0. We want to go kind of where the max for our ground selection is. So that is 8171, or 1871 and 1871. And then we want to feather this just a little bit, because we don't want it to be such a harsh cutoff. And we're going to lower this down, and I think it was about right there. The only way to find out is to create, and maybe it needs to be a little bit higher, and just a little bit higher. Yes, and that looks good. We want a little bit more feathering on the ground, on the minimum. So let's feather that, or fuzzy that a little bit, and we want to fuzzy the top part as well. So let's fuzzy that a little bit, and that looks good. And we already have it created. Let's go to Filter. Let's add Shape Filter, and I'm going to add Cross Hills. Make sure we add our higher hills there. Filter, and I'm going to choose a preset of maybe this. We'll see what it looks like. Not sure, but we'll find out. Yes, that looks good. I like the way that looks. let's see what else we can do. We might want to add a general filter and slope smoothing, and we're going to move this up because they will take effect depending on how these are layered. They will affect the look. So if we were to do cross hills but then do slope smoothing, it will affect the cross hills filter because that came after the cross hills. General rule of thumb, in my opinion, it's just an opinion, is that you put all of your filters on here and then do your erosion passes last. Alright, so I'm just going to do some presets here, and let's look at slope smoothing, and let's do thick snow on low slopes. Let's generate that because I don't want them to be too rough. They do need to be a little bit smooth. Yeah, see, that worked out perfectly. Alright, so let's go to selector again, and this one we are going to add another selector, rename it to mountains, add, and enable this, and we go to the elevation right here, so 3152. So let's go to here and change the minimum value to 3152, add some fuzzy, and the max height I don't want to be all the way up there because our peaks are going to be a little bit different looking. So let's go to about right here, and let's create a mask. And you can see our peaks right here. Those are taking up a little bit too much, so let's lower this even a little bit more, and that was a little too much, and that looks about right. So I'm going to keep that selection, and I'm going to add a little more fuzzy to the minimum. Oops, I didn't want to generate, I wanted to create. So create mask, there we go. And maybe a little bit more to the altitude, create, or to the higher points. Now let's go to filter, and we're going to add, make sure we're on this layer, because when we add, it'll drop it below. Let's add shape filter, strong ridged, select mountains, filter preset, and let's do this, strong, strange, strong, and ridged. Let's generate that. And let's see how it looks. Alright, that is strange. We don't want that. I don't want that. You can have it. I don't want it. Let's do extra strong. Well, you know what? Let's do classic ridged. That one never fails. Let's generate that. Okay, you can kind of see it coming in. It looks good. Alright, next one, selector. Let's add another one. Rename this to tall peaks. And we're going to keep the maximum at the highest value, but we want to go to the maximum that we set for this one, which is 4777. So let's go to tall peaks and change the minimum to 4777. Let's add some fuzziness to this one as well. We don't have to worry about fuzzy on this one because we can't go any higher. So let's create that and see what that looks like. And let's see how it's selecting our peaks. I'm going to add more fuzziness. Come here. Not that much. That looks about right. Maybe a little less. That looks good. Alright, so we created that. Let's go back to filter. We're going to add shape filter, mountains ridged. And if this doesn't look right, I'll go to full ridge because I like the way those look. Make sure we select our tall peaks, filter presets, and mountains ridged, and let's choose high ridges dramatic. Generate. That looks alright. I'm not digging, after we applied the last two filters, I'm not really digging this canyon look that we have, so I'm just going to go here and I'm going to take the general strength down. Let's generate that and see if we can get some of that detail back, because now our ground level's too flat. Okay, that looks a little better. Turn down the edge sharpness. Ground height we'll keep. Top height we'll keep. This edge sharpness, I'm not sure what the difference between these two are. I'm just going to lower this more and generate. I'm going to change the mountains ridged filter to the mountains full. I like the way that looked. Now that brought back some of the detail on our ground level, so I really do like this. Alright, that looks good. I'm going to go here, change this to shape filters, mountains full ridged, filter presets, and let's choose strong ridged. Generate that. There we go. I like the way that looks. That looks good. Now, for the very last selector, we're going to add, and we're going to rename this one to erosion. Hit OK. And what we want to do is we don't want to affect everything, but I do want it to affect from the ground or from the top down. So I'm going to change the minimum value to be about where the hills start. So the max is going to be 3152. So I'm going to go from for the erosion, the minimum value is going to be 3152. And I'm going to add quite a bit of fuzzy to this, like 25. Let's create that. And you can see how it affects all the top peaks, and it's going down towards where our cross hills are, or whatever that filter we used. Yeah, the cross hills. So I want it to be a little lower than that. So let's create it again. And let's go down a little bit lower. Create. And let's turn the fuzziness up. That was too much, so we'll just raise the altitude. Alright, that looks good. And now the erosion will affect all our mountains from the top down to where the ground level is. And that'll look just fine. So let's go to filter, add erosion system, thin flows sediment, and then choose erosion. And the erosion systems have their own filter or selection because you can actually use those as masks to use in post-production. So if you use an erosion system, you can choose these, but don't. Just make sure you choose your erosion selector that you have, and then you can use these selections for masks. So if you import it into View or something, you can get your sediment in there and make it look natural. So just make sure you choose the right one. And let's go to Filter Presets, Thin Flow Sediment, and let's choose Decreasing Strength. This one looks like it's good. And let's generate. Now this one might take quite a long time to generate. So if you need to, just to speed up time, you can go back into the General tab and then the other General tab and change your dimensions from wherever you have it set down like 1 or 2 levels. So mine's set at 1024, I'd probably lower mine to 512. Alright, it's done. Let's go ahead and look at 3D. And the erosion looks good. So I kind of like how that looks. Again, this canyon filter is a little bit too strong. Go back in here and kind of, you can save your project, I believe, project generation. You can save terrain settings, whatnot, but I'm not even going to really care about that because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Generation, Terrain Export, and I'm going to export it as the file format that my game engine requires. So I'll actually tell you in here. So you have to make sure you export it as whatever your game engine requires. So I think for Unreal Engine, you're going to want RAW 16 or even RAW 32 or something like that. I can't remember. If you're using Unity or CryEngine, you can get away with just RAW 16 right here as well. So I'm just going to export it as RAW 16 because I'm using CryEngine. So I'm going to call this test just so we can test it out. Desktop and save. And now that I exported the terrain like it is now, just in case if there's any ridiculous changes after I delete my canyons filter, I already have it saved how it is now because I like how it is now. So let's go ahead and go to canyons and let's remove that entirely and then generate the terrain again. Okay, I didn't really make much of a change because of the cross hills filter kind of adds that little bit of a canyonized effect to it anyways, so it didn't make much of a difference. So I'm just going to keep whatever I just exported. So I already have CryEngine pulled up, so I'm just going to drop this down and pull CryEngine up. And you have to make sure that your game settings reflect that of what you're exporting your terrain as. So if you have your terrain settings set as 4096, make sure you export it as 4096, otherwise it won't work. Mine is set to 1024, I believe anyways, so I exported mine at 1024. And so now here I am inside of CryEngine. Just going to go to the terrain option right here, edit terrain, file, import height map. Test is what I called it, so I'll open that. And here is my terrain. And it doesn't look right because the way it was imported was wrong because of certain things that I didn't check or whatever. So there is a way to change these options, and that is by going to modify and reduce range heavy. I'm doing heavy because it'll make more changes faster, I guess. So that's a good way to word it. And I'm just going to do this a couple times. And we're down to where I might want to be here, so I'm just going to keep doing it a couple times. Now that looks a little better. One more time maybe. Alright, now that looks good. So there's our mountains. Those are our peaks that we made. We have our hills. This right here kind of bothers me because of the filters, but that's okay. We can change any of these that we want actually inside of this editor. We can smooth the slopes and whatnot, so that's okay. Doesn't even really matter. So now if I were to drop into the game, let's go close to a ridge, so like maybe right here. And let's go into the game. Well, I'm going to close this first. Go into the game. Alright, so now I'm in the game. You can throw a grenade and you can run around on it. So this is pretty much it. Now if you get these weird sharp edges like that over there, those will be all over the place. The smoothing filter inside of GeoControl actually helps with that. However, CryEngine, as well as pretty much any game engine, will have its own smoothing option for its terrain. And the way you can do that easily in CryEngine, so you don't have those weird, funky, sharp edges, is go to Terrain, Edit Terrain, Modify, and then Smooth. And that'll smooth it out, and I'll do it throughout the entire terrain. And that does affect your peaks. So your peaks are going to be a little bit more smooth, as you can see. However, that doesn't matter because most of the time you're not going to be up on those peaks, but you can still make them look really good by using good proper materials and textures and even 3D objects that you can import into the engine. So this is kind of far away, but like I said, we created this map at 150 kilometers. So this is going to be a long part of the game. So let's continue going. Before you do anything else in the game, you might want to learn if you can change the actual character model size. I don't know what Crytek set the default character model size at, however, so you could probably change the size so these mountains actually look more mountainous. Or if you have to, you can even go back into the terrain and you can set terrain max height. I think that's it. Let's see. Just raise it a little bit. Didn't really change anything. That's okay. You can re-import at any time. Import, test. And now we have these ridiculous peaks. So we have to go back in and reduce range again. And maybe again. And now instead of having to redo our character model size, now we actually have really tall peaks. And we can fix those ridiculous sharp edges again by using smooth and closing out and going back into the game. Probably should have got closer. Now I'm dead. Alright. let's see. Let's continue running. Get closer to the train here. Let's see. So now they're taller, more peak-like. So you're gonna have to use some trick of the eye or learn if you can scale your character model or whatnot to make it look like they're actually taller. But you have to understand that the peaks and the ridges start there, but the actual mountain starts way down here. So if you look at it right here, you can use some fog or some time of day settings, at least in CryEngine, to make those look taller, but it's going to take forever to run up there. As you can already tell, it's going to take quite a bit of time. So that's how you create a landscape and export it as a file that you can use inside of your game engine. And you should know what your game engine requires. I'm not perfect, I don't know everything, so I'm going to assume that you know at least a little bit of what your game engine requires for you to import your terrains into. So if you have any questions, you can certainly ask, and I'll try to give you my best answer if I actually know the answer. But if I don't hate me, because I don't know every program there is to know on this earth. So I try, but I fail. So anyways, that's that, and good luck in your future adventures.